Please be seated. A quote from C.S. Lewis, Reflections on the Psalms. It is in the process of being worshiped that God communicates his presence to us. It is in the process of being worshiped that God communicates his presence to us. Every moment from the beginning of the prelude to the last note of the postlude is our act of worshiping God. I was tempted to skip the first lesson. And it is done by homilists, but you are not my people, and I am not your God, cannot be ignored. And what was the setting? What was going on? And I went to Kings and Chronicles to find out. It starts with Solomon. Solomon died 922 BC. He had done some things, married some women who worshiped Baal, and God was not pleased. And a prophet told Solomon that the kingdom would be divided when Solomon's son became king. And Solomon's son Rehoboam became king. A delegation from the north asked for relief from Solomon's taxes and forced labor. Rehoboam denied. The north seceded, and a prophet told Rehoboam, God does not want a civil war, so let them go. Israel, the land of the Edomites, called Samaria, the king and his cohorts rejected the Levites as priests and adopted as priests people who worship Baal. Ahab became king of Israel in 869 BC and married Jezebel, the daughter of a king who worshiped Baal. This was the time of Elijah, and Elijah had great difficulties with Jezebel, and his life was threatened several times. He actually ran away once because of his life being threatened. But God told him he had to go back. And there was a contest between the priests of Baal and Elijah. An altar was placed, the gifts were placed on the altar, but there was to be no lighting of the fire by any of the people on earth. And God, the God that is really the God, would light the fire. So we have two altars. One, the prophets of Baal are dancing around and hollering and shouting and wearing themselves out, and nothing happens. Elijah had water poured on the altar, wetting down the wood, and then he prayed to God, and lo and behold, the fire came and consumed the altar and its contents. This made Jezebel extremely angry because Elijah then slaughtered all the prophets of Baal. And Elijah ran away again. Ahab, the king, wanted a vineyard. It was a nice vineyard, and it was near a piece of property that Ahab liked, and he tried to buy the vineyard from Naboth. Naboth was about the fifth generation of people who tended that vineyard, and he would not sell it. And Ahab became depressed. Jezebel asked what the problem was, and Ahab said he wanted that vineyard, and Naboth wouldn't sell it. Jezebel had Naboth killed and gave the vineyard to Ahab. Now, the statement in the Old Testament reading, the blood of the valley of Jezreel, Ahab was slain, his 70 sons were slain, Jezebel was thrown out the window and died on the street, as Elijah had said would happen. So great blood was spilled in the valley of Jezreel, but I feel that the blood that the prophet was referring to was the blood of Naboth, an innocent man who's slain because of greed. Hosea was prophet from 786 to 746 BC, about 160 years after Solomon had died. And he said to Israel, "You are not my people, and I am not your God." Isaiah's prophecy began 738 BC. And as you may remember, Isaiah was a prophet when Israel fell in 722. The caveat in the prophecy that Hosea had was that Israel shall produce people as numerous as the grains of sand, with the implication that perhaps they can win back the favor of God. Now on to the gospel. And I began at 7:30 with a statement that I am not here to tell you that God has forsaken you. I'm here with the good news. And the good news is the gospel. Question is, what is prayer? I think of it as communication with my God. And Jesus gives us the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Anne Lamott, in a book, said that as a youth, she thought that Hal was God's name, not knowing what hallowed could mean. And I looked up hallowed, and it's holy. In our worship service, we sing the Gloria. And if we sing it with gusto, God may believe that we really believe that God is the Holy One, because we keep saying it. The Liturgy and Music Committee spent some time trying to figure out which of 5 Glorias we should use this Sunday, hoping that it would involve most of the people in the congregation. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. God's will is justice for all, with emphasis on widows and orphans. Justice goes beyond obeying the law. And as I was thinking about this, and there are many injustices that aren't illegal, and the example for me came with the housing bubble and mortgages being assigned to people who were not qualified. The banks knew this person could not pay the mortgage. And they came up with 0% or interest-only loans. That amazed me when I heard it. You could get a loan and only pay the interest on the loan for 5 years. And then you owed the balance, a balloon payment. And all this was working because housing prices were going up 10% a year. People who lived in ordinary houses suddenly found they had a house that they could sell for $1 million. So if you buy a 0% interest loan, your house value goes up quite a bit during the 5 years that you have when you're only paying the interest, and then suddenly you have to pay the rest. The other amazing thing was hearing on National Public Radio that people were buying and selling a house in a 24-hour period. Now, I remember I must have signed my name a dozen times when I bought a house, and I had to go and sit and discuss title insurance and title search. And how could they do all this in less than 24 hours? But they were doing it, and there was much speculation in housing. Well, who paid the price when the bubble broke? What caused the bubble to break? People couldn't pay their mortgage. Foreclosures started happening, and it escalated. And who paid the price? It was not the banks that issued the mortgage that paid the price. Those bankers got a lot of money, and they kept it. Taxpayers end up bailing out the banks so that they could continue to exist. Greed and lust. A woman reports having been raped and is put in prison for adultery. That's not in this country, but and she was pardoned when they realized that it might cause an international furor. A woman in the military reports her superior has sexually abused her. She does not get promoted when she's due for promotion next. Are we doing the best we can to fulfill God's will for us? The rest of the Lord's Prayer is familiar to you all, and I won't expound on that. The parable is about a man who is desperate. A friend has been on the road all day long, hasn't had anything to eat, and he stops at his house late at night. The man goes next door to his good friend and knocks on the door and asks for 3 loaves of bread. Now the family is asleep in a crowded room. You can't even get up without stepping on somebody. And to get up and light a lamp is going to wake everybody, and you don't want to wake your children in the middle of the night. So the man refuses, but the pounding on the door and the request for 3 loaves of bread goes on. And finally, the bread is provided. The man persists because of his need is real, and the neighbor responds because he and his family need some sleep. Jesus tells us, "Ask and it shall be given to you." Your request has to be for a need, not as in a recent commercial, "Oh Lord, please send me a Mercedes-Benz." I have 2 incidents that come to mind. One was while I was still on active duty. I was regional response chairman, and a ship departing San Francisco just outside the gate exploded. And an entire tank, or an entire cargo space filled with lube oil additive, was spilled into the ocean. Now, a crude oil spill, a lot of it evaporates, and what doesn't evaporate eventually sinks. But this stuff didn't deteriorate at all. It just started sailing around wherever the currents took it. And one night it was going to pass offshore Tamales Bay. And I thought, good Lord, if an onshore wind comes up, it's going to get blown into Tamales Bay, and this will be an ecological disaster of great proportion. And I wondered if I should pray for it. And I got the message. If you don't pray for it, don't blame me. Yes, sir. So I got on my knees and prayed. And it didn't. It continued to drift north, and it dissipates and keeps getting broken up into smaller and smaller pieces, and eventually is not a hazard to wildlife or sea life. The second case, I had been to visit some high school classmates of mine, and they had an autistic grandson, or I should say a grandson who had autism. And we had a healing prayer service after I got back. And I was wondering whether to ask for prayers for this child with autism or not to ask for prayers. And I got the message, are you trying to decide what I can and can't do? So I got on my knees and was prayed for. Praying for someone else is called intercessory prayer. Listening in a prayerful, compassionate way. Listening with the presence of Jesus in mind is as important as the prayer itself, or perhaps more important. Because when you listen in this way, people will tell you more. We may even be surprised to hear a need for prayer in an ordinary conversation. And without saying a word to anybody, you can invite the Lord in and do your own prayer to that person. Another instance that has happened to me a few times, usually about 3 o'clock in the morning, suddenly somebody's name comes to mind. Have no idea why, but it came to my mind, so I've learned you pray for that person. And in a recent case, I prayed for an academy classmate of mine and sent an email to him and said that I don't know why, but I prayed for you. His wife said that he was due for cataract surgery and he couldn't read the email himself, so she had to read it to him. And then he was shocked. And he was beginning to think, is there really something seriously wrong with me? But I had a little bit of conversation with his wife, and she understood, and and he said they were very appreciative of the fact that someone cared enough to pray for them. So think about prayer. Paul says, pray without ceasing, and you can pray a lot more than you probably think you can if you just participate in what's going on or what you read in the paper. And I'll leave you with what is said in Colossians. Don't let anyone talk you out of your faith.